Welcome to Moments in Time and Space, a microfiction podcast, bringing you tales of horror and suspense with your host, Aaron Maracle. Hello everyone. On Reckoning Day, civilization as we knew it came to an end. Billions of people perished. The once great cities of mankind are now just collections of deteriorating buildings and crumbling streets. Yet, humanity manages to survive and go on living in this desolate place. A young lady by the name of Vixen finds herself lost in one of these great cities, and she knows she is in trouble. She had taken a wrong turn. Vixen go out among the debris in the doorway of a long-abandoned apartment building and scan the area around her. None of the crumbling structures felt familiar, but it was hard to tell since they all looked the same. The years since Reckoning Day had taken their toll in the city. As civilization collapsed, so did many of the buildings that once provided safety and shelter. The wind picked up, and dust swirled around Vixen. Gritty particles of dirt battered her green eyes, and she blinked them a few times, hoping tears would come and wash away the sting. Her eyes filled with salty moisture, and the stinging soon stopped. A few blinks later, and her vision was restored once more. As the wind settled and the clouds of grime faded from the air, Vixen finally spotted what she had been looking for. A faded, large green arrow had been painted on the side of a nearby wrecked car. It looked like it pointed to a narrow alley across the street, and Vixen frowned. She knew that such places were dangerous in this new world, and should be avoided when possible. Everyone knew this, so the arrow had been designed intentionally to make her travels riskier. Vixen contemplated looking for a way around the alley, but that carried the risk of missing the next marker. Vixen stood up and stretched her legs a few times to work out the stiffness. She reached up and rubbed the piece of red cloth that was tied tightly around her left bicep. Davison had drilled into her over and over that above all else, Vixen had to retain possession of this strip of scarlet fabric at all costs. A slight smile crept across her lips as she thought of the gruff older man who had taken her under his wing when they first met. He often teased her that if he had younger legs, he would be out here making this run and putting everyone else to shame. There was no time to be wasted in reminiscing. Vixen was on the clock, and speed was of the essence. With that in mind, she bolted out of the doorway and sprinted towards the alleyway across the street. Every step she took kicked up the dust and grime that covered the cracked asphalt. Her slender form weaved in between the abandoned cars that blocked her direct path to the far side of the street. Vixen cleared the last car and hopped up onto the curb, its edge crumbling in several spots. She carefully scurried to the edge of the alleyway and pressed herself tight up against the rough stone of a flanking building. Blood pounded in her ears as her heart raced and she fought to catch her breath. As soon as she felt her breathing was normal once more, Vixen licked her lips and slowly peeked into the alley. The passage between two tall gray crumbling buildings was silent. A few forgotten trash dumpsters, now twisted and overturned, were visible, along with a scattering of abandoned relics, such as a twisted shopping cart and piles of broken electronics. Nothing but reminders of a world that no longer existed. Taking a deep breath, Vixen cautiously entered the alleyway. She took slow, careful steps and kept an eye out for trouble. She took extra care when she passed by one of the dumpsters. They were large enough to hide someone, or something, that may be looking to prey on an unsuspecting target. Nothing sprang from these containers, and Vixen gave a silent prayer of thanks. The other end of the alley was close, and she could even see another green marker just beyond it. The crudely painted arrow pointed right, and Vixen realized where she was. The map she had memorized was clearly visible in her head, and she realized she was closer to the end of the path than she had expected. A bit of hope began to fill Vixen's heart, and she broke into a quick jog. The sooner she got out of this alley, the safer she would feel. Part of her felt this was a lie because in this world, there was no real safety. It felt like everyone was just living on borrowed time and waiting for the end to come. Paranoia began to wash over her, and Vixen could feel the panic rising in her chest. She began to mentally count down the steps into the alley to focus on the task at hand and hopefully calm herself down. 3 steps. 2 steps. 1 step. She had did it. She had cleared the alley and was back out into the openness of the wide abandoned streets of the city. Taking a sharp right, Vixen almost broke into another sprint, but scrambled to a stop. Shit, 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 Vixen whispered as she quickly crouched behind her nearby wreck. Slowly, She peeked over the trunk of the destroyed vehicle she had taken refuge behind, and cursed again. About 30 feet down the street stood a pack of shambling figures. Shredded and ripped clothing hung from the thin frames of the creatures. They had human form, but most of their flesh was rotting. Some were missing an eye, or a nose, and one even had no arms. Vixen watched the things shuffle aimlessly around the empty street, bumping into each other occasionally. She cursed herself for being careless, and not following Davidson's rule of looking before you leap. Her luck could have been worse. Vixen could have made enough noise coming out of the alley to draw the creature's attention, but that was a small comfort considering her current situation. The direct path was totally out of the question. Vixen could count 9 zombies that she could see, but there was no telling how many more could be lurking down the street out of sight. She would have to double back and go around, hoping that she would not encounter any more trouble. Glancing over her shoulder, Vixen noted that the intersection behind her was a fair distance away. Over the intersection, a battered street sign hung from the remains of a traffic light and read 6th Avenue. If she doubled back and took a left down that street, Vixen figured that she'd only be 2 blocks off the designated path. It was a bit of a detour, but Vixen was confident now she could make up the lost time if she moved faster. Taking a deep breath, Vixen began to creep backwards from the abandoned wreck she had been hiding behind. She would put a little distance between her and the zombie mob down the street before turning, making a quick, quiet dash for 6th Avenue. As she crept backwards, Vixen reached up and checked to make sure the strip of red fabric was still tied around her bicep. She felt relief as her fingers ran over the rough piece of cloth. She could hear Davidson giving her praise for regularly checking that she still had it. Every lesson he taught her seemed to end with, "And remember, don't ever lose your arm cloth, or else you lose everything." The heel of her right boot caught on something and sent Vixen crashing backwards. She landed hard on the broken asphalt and groaned. It took her seconds to scramble back to her feet, and she cursed herself for being so clumsy. The sound of moaning began to fill the air, and Vixen saw some of the walking corpses shuffling in her direction. The commotion of her fall had attracted them, which in turn caused them to be very vocal about what they saw. Those sounds would also attract any other zombies nearby, who in turn would come to see what their brethren were moaning about. Spitting some dirt out of her mouth, Vixen began to sprint towards 6th Avenue. The sounds of her pursuers were fading, but she didn't look back. She stayed in the middle of the street as she ran, and then swung left when she reached the intersection. The way in front of her appeared to be clear, and there were no signs of undead. Her speed was fast, but enough that would exhaust her quickly. The zombies never tired and never rested. That was what made them dangerous. People who didn't know their limits or planned for a long retreat from the unrelenting creatures often wound up as their next meal. Over and over in her head, Vixen repeated to herself her planned detour. 1 street over, 2 streets down. 1 street over, 2 streets down. It was a mantra meant to keep her focused and her spirits up. It also helped her remember the map she had studied before beginning this run, which she was visualizing to ensure she would get back on the marked path. Vixen was so close to the end that it was hard not to just sprint all out, but she forced herself to keep a steady pace that would ensure extra energy if she needed it. The end of 6th Avenue came without incident, and Vixen spun left. 2 blocks down, and then she could cut back to the path and hopefully find the next marker. The street here was thick with the remains of many cars. This forced Vixen to take the narrow sidewalk, which she hated, but didn't have much choice. This traffic jam was probably made by the people who tried to flee the city on Reckoning Day. Instead of escaping, they wound up getting caught in a gridlocked death trap. Vixen did not dwell on this thought too much. She wanted to avoid the same fate the owners of the vehicles had experienced, and to do that, she had to finish this run. The first block was clear of trouble, but halfway down the second block were 2 zombies. They were standing in the middle of the sidewalk and took notice of Vixen's footfalls. The shambling corpses turned towards her and began to moan. Wanting to avoid getting grabbed or bit, Vixen scrambled up onto the nearest wrecked car. She ran on top of the roof, down to the trunk, and leapt to the next vehicle. Her acrobatics echoed off the buildings surrounding the street. With all the racket she was making, Vixen might as well be ringing a dinner bell for the undead hordes lurking in the city. The zombies on the sidewalk watched her pass by them, and Vixen hit the sidewalk once more. At the end of the second block, Vixen headed back towards where the marked path was supposed to be. Less cars on this side street meant that she was free to make her way down the middle of the road, which was good because more zombies were beginning to stagger out of the buildings and the alleys. She pressed on, and focused on getting back on the marked path. As long as she kept ahead of the undead, Vixen knew she would be okay. That is, unless she ran into a pack of shamblers in front of her. There was no time to think about worst-case scenarios. All that mattered now was finding the next marker, and Vixen had a good idea where it might be. She cleared the side street quickly and was back on the original path, or so she had hoped. A wave of relief washed over her as she saw another crudely painted arrow painted high up on a wall of a nearby building. She took off sprinting in the direction the arrow was pointing. I knew she was almost done. Just a little further to go, and she would be safe. Vixen almost didn't need the markers the rest of the run. The last leg of the path was burned into her memory. She ran down the streets, taking turns before she even saw a marker most times. While she did encounter the occasional undead, it was usually a single corpse that was easy to avoid. Down the last street of the path, Vixen almost pumped her fist in the air at what she saw. Looming at the end of the street was a 20-foot makeshift wall of ruined cars and other bits of junk. In the middle of the wall was an entryway about 8 feet high and 4 feet across. A large sheet of rusted steel blocked the entryway. That was Vixen's target, and she slowed her pace. There were a few figures on top of the wall, and Vixen waved to them. "Hey, it's Red! Open up!" The people on top of the wall showed no sign of acknowledging her. Vixen waved again to them, but before she could shout another greeting, the sound of moaning started up behind her. She peeked over her shoulder and saw 4 zombies shambling down the street. They were still a ways back, but Vixen was effectively running toward a dead end. Unless the entry was opened, she was only a few minutes away from becoming the zombies' next meal. "Open up! It's Red!" Vixen shouted again, and she pointed to the strip of red cloth tied around her bicep. "See?" Shouts finally went up from the people on top of the wall, and Vixen sprinted the remaining distance to the entryway. She risked another glance over her shoulder and saw the closest zombie was about 15 feet from her. Vixen pounded on the door twice before she spun around to deal with the corpse that was closing in on her. The undead creature stumbled forward with its arms outstretched, hoping to grab its prey and feast on its flesh. When it was close enough, Vixen lashed out with a quick, solid kick to its chest that sent the walking corpse tumbling to the ground. It rolled back into the 2 other zombies and brought them all down in a heap of limbs. The sound of grinding gears filled the air, along with metal squealing. Vixen turned back to the entryway and saw the metal sheet was slowly sliding upwards. The opening beyond showed nothing but darkness. Every clink of the gears was matched by the growing sounds of more zombies coming down the street towards Vixen. The 3 on the ground were still trying to get back to their feet, and once they did, there would be a small mob of corpses coming for her flesh. Vixen was not going to let that happen, and risked a look at the entryway. The metal sheet was about 2 feet off the ground, and still rising slowly. That was enough for what Vixen needed. She dropped her hands and knees before spinning around. As quick as she could, Vixen crawled through the open gap under the sheet. Once she was clear of the bottom of the sheet, it slammed back down and engulfed her in darkness. Flipping on her back, Vixen lay there and tried to catch her breath. From outside the darkness, a muffled voice boomed over a staticky speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, your winner of this month's race is the Red Runner! Collect your winnings from the cashier at your leisure." More squeaking metal filled the chamber, and it sounded like something was being turned. There was a clunk, and another swung outwards from the far side of the chamber. Daylight flooded in through the open doorway. 2 figures came in and helped her to her feet while checking her over for injuries. She shrugged them off and stepped out of the chamber. Vixen found herself in a large courtyard filled with people and stalls. They greeted her with cheers, and she offered them a small wave in return. A burly hand thrust a cup of water into her hands. "That was a fine run. Our spars were sure you were done on that last turn." Vixen took the cup and gulped down the cold water. She offered the owner of the burly hand a smirk. "I had it under control, Davison." The large, heavy-set man laughed out loud and slapped a beefy hand on her back that nearly knocked the wind out of her. "Sure you did. After all, who trained you?" Through the sweat running down her eyes, Vixen looked up at the large makeshift tote board that hung over the chamber she had just exited. Crooked columns drawn in chalk covered its surface. One column had several colors written in it next to a series of odds. Some of the colors had been scratched out, obviously casualties of the race. "Well, Chet says your win earned you 2 weeks of rations, plus 15 liters of clean water. Minus my cut, of course," Davison said. "Next race is in a month. Are you in?" Vixen polished off the last of the water and licked her lips. "Yeah, I'm good for another run." Who are you betting on in the next Dead Run? Thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. You can also follow me on Twitter at MomentsInTAS. Feel free to recommend this podcast to others and help it grow. The opening and closing theme is Creepy Night by Daniel Carlton. Until next time, be safe, be smart, and be well. See you soon.